Because generally, if there was an interview going on with Kurt, you would have one of them making, putting fingers behind his head or dancing around the background, or that just sort of was the personality of the band that's been captured on video, and certainly that was the way they were in concert. Very fun going, let's just not take anything seriously. But both of those players are very intelligent people and quite bright.
I like to describe Dave as Art Garfunkel with balls. Imagine. Seriously, he was the final element musically in what made the band great, and he was another stabilizing influence, I think, in the psychology of the band and the fact that it can continue playing. And you can see that right up until the great MTV concert, when at one point Cobain is insecure about whether he can handle one of the songs and whether he should play the song solo, and it was Dave Grohl who said, go for it. So I think that it was that human interplay that helped make the band great musically.
Grohl was only with the band for their last few years. Novoselic and Cobain really had about a 10-year relationship, which was much deeper probably than anybody else Kurt had ever dealt with in his life. He probably was as close to Chris as he was to anybody.
In 1990, Kurt met Courtney Love for the first time at a concert in Portland where the band were performing. The two were immediately attracted to each other, starting a tempestuous relationship that lasted for the next 2 years. This finally led to marriage on a Hawaiian beach in February 1992. 6 months later, Courtney gave birth to their daughter, Frances Bean. Kurt and Courtney's relationship was constantly tested to the limit, with Courtney often having to deal with the consequences of Kurt's drug addiction, depression, suicide attempts and periods in drug rehab. By 1991, a huge buzz had built up around the band, and after a massive record company bidding war, Nirvana signed with Geffen Records. With this, for the first time, came money, a new experience for the band, and for Kurt particularly, this meant access to any drugs he desired. Nirvana were ensconced in Sound City Studios in LA to record what would become one of the most important albums ever made. There are only a handful of albums over the last 50 years that have really changed music. Nevermind was to become one of them.
Even by major label standards, it was done fairly quickly. And even on Nevermind, from what I understand, Kurt probably didn't do more than 1 or 2 takes on any of the vocals. What I think it came down to, I think Butch Vig was a little more meticulous about drum sounds, about layering, about, he had a chance to see the band rehearse beforehand. He had demos. They basically spent more time on it and were more meticulous about the technical aspects of it. I think performance-wise, the band probably didn't do anything terribly different in the studio from how they did Bleach. It's just they were a better band at that point, and they didn't have to do a whole album in 3 days. They had a couple of weeks. And again, it's the fact that the songwriting was strong that makes it work like that. It didn't need a lot of extra bullshit added to it. So again, Butch just captured what they were about at the time, and same way Albini did later for the third record. They literally recorded it live, and he did the vocals over, and it was almost the same way we recorded Bleach. Just, Albini's aesthetic is a little different from mine, but he essentially did the same kind of job that I was trying to do on Bleach, which was just, okay, this is the band wants me to just capture what they're doing because they're so good at what they're doing, they don't need a lot of production. That's the funny thing about Nirvana. They were very good at what they were doing. Nobody really could produce them.
The timing of Nevermind's release could not have been better. The first single, Smells Like Teen Spirit, and its accompanying video were virtually on continual loop at MTV and radio stations across the world. The album was a critical and commercial smash, breaking records around the world and propelling Nirvana to the top of both the rock and pop worlds.
By January of '92, his record was #1, and he was a huge star. So things changed almost overnight, but I don't think anyone could have predicted the level of success they had. And in some ways, I don't think they even wanted that much success. They wanted to be the biggest band in the world, but they really didn't want the pressures, the demands that came with that. And so I think it surprised everybody. It surprised Kurt as much as anybody else.
There's this danger of revisionist talk where people claim that they always knew. But if you go back to like the Rolling Stone review that when Rolling Stone reviewed Nevermind the first time, they called it basically a mediocre record. You know, you read the Rolling Stone now, and they basically pretend that they always knew that Nirvana was the most brilliant thing on the planet. You know, after that Nirvana left on tour to support Nevermind in 1991 with plans. Kurt talked about like, I'm going to take after this tour, support this record. I'm going to take the money that I got and build a studio in Olympia. And he, even had a building that he wanted to rent. And then they just kept extending the tour, and they basically never came back. Kurt's, as a matter of fact, his landlord evicted him for not coming back. He didn't pay his rent. He didn't move his stuff out, and as I understand it, his landlord just threw his stuff out onto the street.
Having relentlessly toured and promoted Nevermind, in February 1993, the band hit the studio again, this time to record tracks for their third album, In Utero. For the first time, Nirvana were afforded the luxury of having as much time as they needed in the studio. Helmed by Steve Albini, the sessions saw an altogether more thoughtful and experimental sound emerging.
I think in some ways the last album he made, In Utero, is the most sophisticated in terms of the sound, in terms of the recording, and in terms of the lyrics. And the video for Heart-Shaped Box, I think, could be considered his masterpiece. I think Chris Novoselic called it his last will and testament. And it's an amazingly sophisticated and interesting piece of art.
Personally, I think In Utero is their best record artistically. And then, again, that record is almost start to finish about Kurt. It's autobiographical, Teenage angst has paid off well. He begins, talking about it. I mean, this is his life. It's not anyone else's.
It's too complicated to discuss, I suppose, but it is in some ways a portrait of his marriage. Originally, it was the song Heart-Shaped Box was called Heart-Shaped Coffin. I think Courtney probably convinced him that was a bit too downbeat for a description of a marriage, and their marriage wasn't entirely downbeat. He changed it to Heart-Shaped Box to celebrate the famous heart-shaped box that she gave him as a symbol of their love. But it also expressed much more than that. It was a picture of his soul in the universe, and it was a portrait of the artist as a martyr, and it was it's a beautiful rock and roll song. I would say that's the summation of his work, but all the albums are worth listening to, and I think they'll all last.
As a songwriter, he found his groove when he began to write his own story. And, the shame is, of course, that we didn't get to see that story turn into maturity, because I think there were a lot of great songs that he still had left in him.
In January 1994, following the inevitable commercial success of In Utero, Nirvana started a recording session at Robert Lang Studios in Seattle. The band recorded several songs, including the now infamous You Know You're Right.
The one that's been in the courts between Courtney and Dave and Chris and the attorneys, You Know You're Right, it was that song that we did here. And like I say, it's just that song particularly really is a wonderful recording, and it went on really well here. They were so stoked, the band, from the tracks on that and some other tracks that they did, but that particular track got more attention. Of course, Kurt's vocals were finished on that song.
Tragically, this was to be Kurt's last time in a recording studio. On the 8th of April 1994, he was found dead at his home in Seattle, a gunshot wound to his head and a gun by his side. Most of the material recorded at Robert Lang's studios was subsequently withheld, but in 2002, after many long legal wrangles, a song from that session was finally released, with many fans ecstatic to hear Kurt's voice again.
I was one of the very first people to hear You Know You're Right, other than the band members. I heard it a couple years into working on my book. And, obviously that song was released last year and everybody got a chance to hear it, but I assume that most people are going to have the same response when I heard it. When I heard it, what really surprised me is that it was like I never thought I'd hear that voice again, especially singing such a powerful, emotionally Latin song. And I was almost in tears hearing it, because I was just shocked that there was another great Nirvana song that hadn't been released. There was something about the way he sang that really moves me. I think that Kurt was able to put a lot of emotion in everything he did.
The impact of Kurt Cobain and Nirvana on an unsuspecting world is still being felt, as their musical influence, even to this day, continues to play a big part in contemporary rock and pop. There are very few bands who simply change the face of music overnight. So what will be their legacy, and how should they be remembered?
I think Nirvana should be remembered not for Cobain's death, but for the life of their music, for the inspiration of his melodic gift, for the extreme seriousness of his artistic enterprise, for the sense of play that he infused it with. He was not by any means the most promising musician when things started out in the late 80s, but he became the greatest, and I think he will so remain.
In some ways, I do look at his life and I see some level of heroism for the fact that he was able to take that pain of his childhood and his growing up and create art out of it. Most people that have that kind of inner pain sit in their lazy boy recliner, eat Doritos, watch television, they don't do anything. Kurt took that pain and gave us a gift. He gave us art with it. And to me, that is in some ways even a way to admire him. Very few people are able to make those choices and be that courageous with their pain. And so, for that reason alone, I admire his ability to take those kind of artistic risks.
Yeah, it was an amazing feeling. I was proud of him. I was happy for him, and it's just fun to see someone that you're friends with be successful.
They've been pegged as this band that changed the 80s to the 90s pretty much. They knocked down all those barriers, and you could just wear jeans and t-shirts and play guitars, and they weren't all the glam rock stuff that they supposedly just pretty much took the bottom out of. I think they'll always be remembered like that. I used to think that it was going to end and people were going to stop. They were going to be forgotten like Kajagoogoo or Duran Duran, but now I'm pretty sure that they've got their place in history.
Nirvana was a band that connected with people, the sensibilities. That whole Beatles sort of get in there and hook 'em thing. Kurt was into that, and he knew how to do it like a master. And none of the other bands had that going for them at that time.
They just happened to hit it right, hit the right tune, just like Glenn Miller when he was getting his band ready.
What sold Nirvana was Nirvana. You just had to hear them. That's all you had to do.